Okay, let's do part 2. We were leaving off from the evolution of the dark triad to the dark tetrad, and that's in its most current form. The sadism is an important component that was kind of left out previously that just allowed us to explain criminal behavior that looks like it intentionally goes beyond psychopathy, goes beyond manipulation, goes beyond narcissism to the actual desire to hurt others. And we find that this is a powerful human force, sadism, and one of the scariest ones, if you will, this idea that some people will harm others just because they take pleasure in harming others, right? And one of the chief indicators, and we don't talk as much about this in juveniles and children because we believe that their personalities aren't fully formed yet until we hit late teens, early 20s. So we don't necessarily want to label children with negative personality traits, right, that set up a self-fulfilling prophecy. That becomes problematic. But cruelty to animals, animal torture, animal killing, cruelty to animals is a predictor of nothing good. Let's put it that way. So if this is something we observe in children, that this should be like a 4-alarm fire bell, right? If we observe that, intervention is required like now. Right? So, continuity and change in personality over time. Well, studies show that adult personality is relatively stable, right? And that's exiting out of adolescence, as I was describing. It becomes more stable with age. So we kind of just gel. We kind of coalesce into who we're going to become over time. And correlation coefficients for repeated tests, right? So we have longitudinal measures that are being correlated over that time, even years apart, range anywhere from 0.5 to 0.7. And in this case, correlations of 0.5 are huge, and 0.7 is just astounding, right? Now, patterns of change in personality with age also occur, right? Some of the changes in personality that occur with age are relatively consistent across samplings of individuals, and it kind of then presents a picture of a very kind of consistent form of human development. And this just shows that many of us develop along a similar trajectory, right? And has a lot to do with the stages of life that we find ourselves in. So, consistent across is just increased maturity. And let's take a look at this idea, this graph here. Big 5 scores and age, and what we see is 21 years of age. So this is when we're thinking that personality, 21, 24, is pretty much formed. And what do we see? Well, what we see then, and the solid lines are females, the dotted lines then are males, and let's take the teal lines here. That represents neuroticism, and what we see then is neuroticism tends to decline in females over time, and neuroticism remains pretty much stable and lower in males than it would in females. Let's pick on conscientiousness, and those are the blue lines, and we can see that conscientiousness slightly lower, just slightly lower in males, but statistically significantly lower because these samples can be incredibly large, tens of thousands of people over time. So what we see though is there's a general upward trajectory for conscientiousness over time, and like, does that surprise anyone that you become more conscientious as you become older? Most of us simply do, right? I can't even describe how much more conscientious I am as I've aged. Now notice, openness changes very little. It reduces slightly, but we're talking over the lifespan maybe 8 points on average for men, and pretty much flat line for women. And let's see, which one haven't we described? Introversion, extroversion remains pretty much the same, and that shouldn't really present a surprise. So, a couple things that we know. People vary, so people run the gamut from high to low on these traits. People do tend to follow predictable trends over their lifespan, and there do appear to be at least small gender differences, right? And some of those gender differences really probably are best explained in terms of social forces more so than anything. But getting a little off topic there. So, what is the relationship of personality to into our genetic material. And this is interesting because what we're finding is that genetic components can play a huge role in personality, at least in terms of predisposition. So if we think in terms of personality, we're predisposed genetically to extroversion or introversion. We're predisposed to high levels of conscientiousness or undirectedness. Some are now arguing, and been arguing over a couple decades, that we're predisposed or not to psychopathy. When you're looking at mental illness, you probably remember reading about the predisposition to schizophrenia, that there's a genetic component. But the diathesis stress model said, I may be predisposed to schizophrenia, but it's important in adolescence to have certain triggering mechanisms that kick that schizophrenia into high gear, so to speak. That may be the case with psychopathy, right? I think some other traits are less mutable than that. But it's the study of heritability, the degree to which individual differences derive from differences in genes rather than differences in environmental circumstances. And studies have shown that traits identified by trait theories are rather strongly heritable. And we'll take a look at a graph here in a minute on the Big Five. Right? So personalities of biologically relatives raised in the same family are generally no more similar than those who are reared apart. Let's take a look then. What we can do here, I think one of the great tests, and there's a couple different types of research, but let's look at comparing 123 pairs of identical twins to 127 pairs of fraternal twins. Certainly a decent sized sample, right? Not the hugest sample in terms of personality assessment, but generally large samples are necessary in this type of research. And as I suggested, we go to the Big Five because the Big Five is the gold standard. There's been more written on it. There's been more research done with it. We know more about it. So anytime we want to test a new proposition that has to do with traits, we generally pick the traits, the Big Five, because we have the hugest body of literature behind us. So what can we see? Well, the teal bars then are the identical twins, the red bars are the fraternal twins, and the correlations run along the bottom axis there. What do we see for neuroticism? Well, we see a relatively high concordance, that is what, 40% for identical twins, but only 28% for, oh no, I'm reading that all wrong, about 18% for fraternal twins. So we know that fraternal twins share 50% DNA, identical twins 100% DNA. Huge differences then in the correlations, the within twin correlations based on the shared genetic material. Look at extroversion. My God, we're talking about 55% concordance in identical twins. Makes a great case for a genetically linked trait, right? Openness, even more so, almost 60%. Agreeableness, going down a little bit down to the level of neuroticism, and conscientiousness in the same ballpark. All this makes a strong case for the genetic predisposition to the expression of traits as adults. So 40 to 50% of our traits, at least like on the Big Five and some other traits, is probably genetically determined. And I think that's fascinating, and I think behavioral genetics is a huge, fascinating area for those looking for a research area. So, reciprocal determinism was developed, the idea, by Albert Bandura. And what he says is, what's hard to understand is, if we look at these three components, and this is where people started, I'm going to add more here in a minute, but we look at personality, and what might we say? Well, I'm extroverted or outgoing, and that describes my personality. Now, the environment that you'll typically find me in is I seek out fun at social gatherings. So I'm more likely to be found at a social gathering than I would be an introvert, right? And then behavior we might notice in extroverts is I enjoy starting conversations with strangers. But we get this chicken egg problem. Well, we need a three-point metaphor rather than just chicken and egg. Go figure. I'm not sure what it would be. But what Bandura is saying, these all reciprocally influence each other. So someone has a personality, but it manifests itself in a behavior, and the behavior then is best actualized in a certain environment. And that can strengthen that component of the personality. So that's why we have these crazy bidirectional arrows going every which way, because all of these are related. So to determine how we fall in the personality traits, then, according to Bandura, becomes our predisposition, the behaviors, and our environment. And behaviors can be even more complex. It could be history of rewards and punishments as we add that in. But you can see that this is the cycle that we run through to become who we are. Except that later in time, people come along and say, well, you know, genetics, we're finding a lot about genetics. And if genetics can determine 40 to 50% of personality, then the threshold for excitement, extroversion, all these kinds of things, all these factors that might have genetic components, right, then go to kind of predispose the personality characteristics. But there's one other piece of the model that needs to be put in, and this is where neuroscience comes in. How do differing brain structures happen here? And right now we're looking at brain structure and neurotransmitter functioning, right, as a function of feeding into personality. But I'm sure already some of you are thinking, but wait, experience can shape the brain, right? And experience changes neurotransmitter levels. So we can see that there might be arrows that come back to biology to some extent, and there might even be arrows, but then we're getting too complicated at this point in time. Fascinating. Genetic research, neuroscience are the big places to be, and that's where the contributions will be made. Okay. So we've talked about traits, we've talked about genetics as a predisposition, but we've also included the fact that the environment and behaviors can affect this relationship. Let us move on to the last part then, the promised patterns in personality. And then what we're talking about here is type, and I just pulled this definition from almost the first slide, so we're repeating it because it was a long time ago. Especially important dimensions, clusters of traits that are not central to a person's personality, but are found with essentially the same patterns in many people. So these might not have the same predictive value, right? They're central to a person, but we're talking something different here. And now I want you to go to humanetrics.com, and you can see the website there, and take the Myers-Briggs type inventory. And I feel pretty good about these two tests, giving you guys these tests, because we talked last time and I asked how many of you knew your scores. Most of you said you didn't. So let's take these two tests, right, as the basis of our assignment. Now, what do we know about types? Well, what does that mean? What is a personality type? And Myers-Briggs type inventory looks at 4 dimensions. So there's 4 dimensions that Myers-Briggs felt were important. And do you know who actually designed the initial theory behind this test? Yeah, Myers-Briggs went, you know, and became famous for it. But who is the psychologist, the theoretician, who initially proposed this idea? You'll sometimes hear this called the Jungian typology. Carl Jung is really the brains behind this, if you will. So what do we know? Well, we've already talked about the introverted, extroverted dimension, and we can be placed somewhere along that dimension, right? Arrayed along that dimension. His personality theory said that if we function well in our environment, we have a balance of opposite traits. So to be a perfectly functioning individual, which doesn't exist, but in Jungian typology, what we're talking about is a balance of extroversion and introversion. So the sweet spot tends to be in the center of these scales, right? Now, what is sensing and intuitive? Well, sensing is people who are in touch with the here and now and rely a huge amount on the sensory experience. These are people who find it pretty easy to be in the moment. Intuitive, on the other hand, is people who have a hard time being in the moment, but have a relatively easy ability to imagine what could be. And you can see, am I in the here and now, or am I off in some other space of my own creation, that is, using my intuition? it would be valuable to be in the moment and be able to be intuitive, that is, go on information that isn't necessarily present as well. So again, balance. Now, thinking and feeling. Do you tend to rely more on thinking your way through an issue, or do you tend more to rely on what your feelings tell you about the issue? Thinking and feeling. Again, balance would be key, that yes, I have the cognitive capacity, but I'm also in touch with my feelings about it. And then finally, judging and perceiving. Now notice, perceiving is a straightforward process. Perceiving is the perceptual process that takes place in our brain and says, hey, this is what is there. This is your perception of it. Notice that the judging is adding or evaluating the contents of perception. Without judgment, right, we would be able to perceive, let's say, a reward or a punishment, but we wouldn't be able to label them as a reward or punishment because we have no judgment that we can apply to it as being positive or negative. So, judging, totally important, right? But judgments can also interfere with honest perception. So again, it's a balance, being able to do both, to perceive without judgment or to be in touch with the judgments. So Myers-Briggs type inventory, you're going to take it and you are going to be presented with an analysis. And this is my analysis. So I'm known, I am on the extroverted side. So if you take the midpoint and you say, okay, so where's Mark? Well, okay, 44% on the extroverted side, right? With the potential of going way the heck out. Now, intuitive side, pretty high on the intuitive side, right? But not too much in the moment. And this is something that characterizes me. I have a hard time being in the moment quite often. I'm often thinking about other things, right? I prefer thinking as information to feelings, but not tremendously so. And I'm really relatively high in the judging. And what this does then is if you take the fancy-ass letters, E instead of I, right? And then N, because the I's already been used in the first one, N, T, J, and that's how this works. It will deliver you 4 letters, that becomes you, that's you. So type ENTJ, and then what do? You take ENTJ and you type ENTJ into Google or ISFP or whatever 4-letter combination you come up with, because there's 24 possible combinations, right? And then you can see, hey, the executive, and what is that? They're natural born leaders. They live in a world of possibilities where and that's the intuitive part, where they see all sorts of challenges to be surmounted. They want to be the one responsible for surmounting them. They have a drive for leadership, and that's supported by the extroversion, well served by their quickness to grasp complexities. That is the judging and the intuition combined. Ability to absorb lots of impersonal information, that's the thinking, right? And quick and decisive judgments that typifies the judging aspect. They're take-charge people. Sometimes they're called field marshals, etc. So, does this predict anything? And you'd say, well, they're calling it the executive, this person. But what we find is, when we do the research, that the Myers-Briggs is probably the biggest joke on all of us because it predicts nothing with any level of reliability whatsoever. Now, people love it and they think it's bitchin', but the predictive validity of the Myers-Briggs is pretty much the suck. Right? This is pretty funny. Now, unlike the predictive validity of the Big Five, and that's the case, but part of your assignment then is going to be to find a research article that addresses this. Last point here. So at this point, you've taken 2 personality tests. You're good to go. You're getting ready for the assignment. One more point. Taxonometric versus continuum measures. Taxonometric approaches seek to place someone in a category, a taxon, if you will. Most measures are of this type. For example, psychopathy is developed by Hare in the psychopathy checklist, revised, right? There's a possible score of 0 to 40. So they look at 20 different components, 20 different traits and behaviors, scored 0, not at all, 1, present some of the time, 2, present all the time, and from 0 to 40 is the score that you can receive. Hare says anyone who's 30 or above, we're going to call a psychopath. So with psychopathy, it's a taxonometric measure. There's 2 boxes that you can be put in, right? That is, you can be put in the non-psychopath box, or you can be put in the psychopath box. 30 is the dividing line. Problems for me, especially since I'm a social psychologist, and social psychologists tend to like continuous measures rather than taxonometric measures. Clinicians often prefer taxonometric measures. I'm okay with the statistics needed to look at a number, and here, you know, in a continuous fashion. I don't need a cutoff point necessarily. Let's suppose then you know that a psychopath is 30 or above. Let's suppose your daughter brings home her new boyfriend and he scores 29 on the psychopathy scale. No. Not having it, not going to endorse this relationship, right? 29 is close enough to 30 to be, but there's a line there. So he's not a psychopath. Close enough. So you can see how continuous measures sometimes irritate certain types of researchers. Now, continuum approach place one on a continuous scale. So rather than either or, it basically describes how much. But it does it in a less precise and a more nebulous fashion, right? So, I mean, there's trade-offs. I'm not saying one approach is good and the other's bad. I'm saying there's trade-offs in both approaches. We should be used to this in this class by now. So, what's the assignment then? Please take the Big Five and the MBTI. What's your initial impression of your scores of each? You do not have to share your scores if you do not want to, or you can. I believe this is an individual assignment, right? So, what do you think would be more accurate in predicting, but check that, because what do you think would be more accurate in predicting your future behaviors? The MBTI or the Big Five, right? Because that's what it's about, it's predicting behaviors. And first to answer that question in general, it would be, but then come back at it and give me an example or two of a prediction in a specific domain, right? Of the two tests, pick one and do a literature search to find an article assessing the predictive validity of the measure in a given context. So do your search, your lit search, and this should be relatively easy to find, right? A one-paragraph summary should suffice, and I want a citation on this one, so make sure you cite the article so I know what article you used. I have an ulterior motive. You guys are doing some field work for me for personnel psychology, because this is something that we look at in personnel psychology. To what extent do these measures predict on-the-job performance? So your lit search will help me out and include more articles for personnel psychology next semester. So thank you in advance. Which test is taxonometric, which is continuous? I'm hoping that's an easy question to answer. And then returning to question 3, what might the taxonometric continuous nature of the test have to do with the ability of the measure to successfully predict future behavior? So here I'm looking, do you really understand the difference between continuous and taxonometric and their predictive validity at large between the two types? There is no wrong answer there, right? So multiple points are possible. Just make one point via example. I don't need to see you go back and forth, because I know you can, but I don't want to for the length of this assignment, right? So just one point via example. It's not right or wrong. What I'm looking for is the quality of your thought on that. Did you think it through? And that's it for our brief, well, maybe not too brief in your book, my idea of brief kind of lecturette on personality. And if this leaves you in pain, let me see if I can erase the pain. What the heck do you think about that cutie? And this is just one of many kittens that has a happy home somewhere that we placed with Happy Home. And funny thing is, 90% of the kittens that we've placed have been placed with, you guessed it, Ohio State students. So this little fella and I both wish you a go Bucks, and thanks for your time, guys.